Hello, everybody. This is Mohseni. I'm so excited to be here today with Alyssa Abo, Dr. Alyssa Abo. She is an incredibly active physician executive in the startup space and digital health space. And I've had the pleasure of knowing you, Alyssa, for a little while now, and I've always been so impressed with everything that you're doing. So please kind of introduce yourself, and why don't you kind of share a little bit about the kind of overview of your career arc?
Sure. Sounds good. Well, thanks, Alex, for having me. I know we haven't known each other very long, but I find our conversations always quite entertaining. So I was thrilled to be on this podcast today. So like Alex said, I'm Alyssa Abo, and by background, I'm a pediatric emergency physician. So I think that's one of the things that you and I have in common, that we hit it off from the start. Interestingly, though, my career really started before that. So I actually went to engineering school. I'm not sure if you know that. And that was my segue into medical school. And that was really a perfect fit for me. I was growing up a total tech nerd, which may or may not come as a surprise to you. But I always loved technology. You know, my games growing up were ColecoVision, Atari, and then Nintendo was, the big one to come on the scene. But I really was always drawn to tech. And so that really was the theme throughout my career. And I will say at times in medicine, it was maybe interesting to people that, while they were focused on other types of research and I was always looking at the technology. So with that, I went to med school after engineering school, and I was very fortunate to actually go to med school in Israel, which even at the time, 20 years ago, which, you can do the math, really dates me, but was quite an innovative place. And there was so much technology around when I was training that I think I was really drawn to that. And at that point started to really see like, okay, I came from engineering school, but this is what it looks like in the hospital. This is how people are using technology. And then fast forward, did residency and actually ended up doing 2 fellowships. So did residency in pediatrics. Taking care of kids is really, one of my big passions, and still advocating for them now from a technology perspective is something that's very near and dear to my heart. But, similar to you, I'm a total adrenaline junkie, and I was really drawn to emergency medicine. And I thought, okay, pediatric residency, emergency medicine fellowship, this is good. I'll be a pediatric ER doc. And that's what I did for over 20 years. But interestingly, I did a second fellowship in emergency ultrasound. And at the time, I did that because when I would do rotations in the adult world, I was like, oh, they're using ultrasound. Why don't we have that? And I will say, for better or worse, 20 years later, sometimes I look, even from a technology standpoint, like, oh, we do that for adults. Like, why don't we do that for kids, right? So anyway, that's really the backdrop to how my career got started. And then throughout my time in academics early on, I really was focused on point of care ultrasound and really trying to figure out how to incorporate that into the pediatric space. But what I'll say is over time, it became clear to me that it wasn't so much about the ultrasound. It was really more about the technology and how bringing in new technology could really change how we practice medicine. So with that, over the last few years, I from within academics started working more with startups and advising companies and really trying to figure out, okay, how can we bridge that gap between industry, not only large med tech companies, but also startups, and really start to help them grow their companies so that what they build actually matters for us clinically. Right. And little by little, I started getting drawn into the startups like, hey, can you be an advisor? Or, hey, would you be interested in a part-time role? And that's really how my career evolved. And, when you talk about the arc, like that's really sort of where it is now. But I would say over time, I went more and more into the industry side. And so on balance, I work less clinically, but I do still try to pick up a few shifts here and there just to keep up my skills and do what really, really brings me so much joy in how I got into this in the first place, which is taking care of kids.
That's amazing. I remember one of the first times that point of care ultrasound was of value to me. I was working in Reston ER, and this lady came in with a pretty good story for retinal detachment. And it is so hard to do an eye exam with like the broken tools we have in the ED. Even when the tools work, I usually don't know what I'm doing with these tools. You know? So I put the ultrasound on, and it was like a textbook case of retinal detachment. And I was able to snap a picture of it, and I sent it to the ophthalmologist, and the ophthalmologist was blown away. It was just so fantastic. That's amazing that you did that. So how many years have you been doing some sort of non-clinical stuff?
Oh, so that's a really good question. Probably like 15, 16 now. And reason being, I think at the time it didn't really even occur to me that I was working in industry. I was full-time academics. I was on the straight and narrow. I had the academic pathway on my radar. I knew exactly what I needed to do to go from trainee to instructor, right? All of that. But all the meanwhile, because I was focused on point of care ultrasound, so POCUS, we were putting on the conferences and we were doing the educational piece, which definitely fit into the academic track. But in order to do that, I had industry partners. And so they would help me provide equipment for the conferences we put on, and similarly ask for feedback on some of the technologies they were building. So in some way, I was always partnering with industry, I think, before I even really realized I was doing that. And then over time, some of those relationships formalized. And so I would be asked to be a medical advisor for a day and come sit in and listen to the technologies they were developing and what I thought would be relevant for my patient population. And then little by little, it's like, well, maybe you'd like to be an advisor for us, in a more formalized way. So I would say the dynamic and the relationship changed, but this notion of working with industry started very early in my career. And honestly, it happened by accident.
So one of the things that you and I have discussed a couple of times is how, as you get better in this sort of advisory capacity, more and more companies want a chunk of your time, and they promise you, oh, we're going to give you this or that equity, and 90%, if not more, of these companies don't end, like they all fail, right? So you put in all this time, you don't really get any financial compensation out of it. So talk to me a little bit about the frustrations with that aspect. What have you learned? What have you experienced? What are some of the lessons learned there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I chuckle a little because I think of all of the time and effort and energy that I just gave away for free, and maybe it's not exactly free because in exchange, I learned something. And so I think that is for sure incredibly valuable. But there were times where companies would say, oh, we're thinking about breaking into pediatrics. Why don't you come up for a day and give a talk on pediatrics? And so I would, right? Because I thought, you want to do something for kids, I'm there. And then conversations afterwards were like, okay, so if I'm an advisor for you, what's the compensation look like? He's like, oh, we wouldn't pay you. We have so many doctors that we can use for free. Like, we'll leverage that. We'll get back to you. And you're like, what? Yeah. So I think collectively, early on, we all a little bit ruined it for each other, all because we were so well-intended. And I don't think any of us were in it for the money. And I still don't think that I'm in it for the money. You and I have talked about this before, like, how do you actually create a sustainable career that's maybe in part clinical and in part advisory or something else? But you're absolutely right. I think sometimes we sell ourselves short, or maybe we don't value our time enough. And that's one lesson learned for sure over time, is that I'm now just really focused on not only how I manage my time and where I am, because I feel like time is our most valuable currency, and it's our only finite resource in a way, right? So every day you have the same hours and you have to figure out how to spend them. Right. And that's not to say that I still don't do things for free, or I don't volunteer or pay it forward. I for sure do. But I think for those relationships you're talking about, advising companies or potentially having fractional roles, it's really important to be compensated and be valued for your time. And if that feels really awkward to people listening, think about the rest of us. Like, we all have to a little bit sing the same song so that people understand the value that we bring. And I think fundamentally we're trying to do good things, and especially the pediatrics among us. I mean, who's nicer than your kid's pediatrician, right? So, I mean, I feel like it's very easy to continue to give, and companies will take, and you have to find that balance of feeling good about what you're offering and then what you're potentially getting in return. So with that, I do think early on, I did do a lot for free, and I did do a lot for equity and not for, what we would consider you and I cash compensation. And that made sense. It was low stakes for the people who were investing in me in a way, and it was low stakes on my end. And so I think maybe in some ways the bar was set a little lower, but for sure over time, as physicians, and again, we'll talk about physicians. It's the group of people I feel most close to. So this could totally apply to nurses and techs and pharmacists and other people in the medical ecosystem who are super smart. So I never want to leave them out. But I think over time, it's really important for that particular physician to think, okay, here's the time I want to give, here's the value that I bring, and really also understanding that value, because I don't think that's always very clear at first when you start out.
Yeah. And I think early on in one's career, it's okay to do a lot of this stuff. It's more okay to do a lot of this stuff for free because you're learning a lot, right? And you just want to get exposure and all of that. But definitely, like, as you get more seasoned, you want to get compensated. Like, when I look back to all the work I've done for various startups, I don't think any of the equity I've ever got with any of them turned into anything ever.
Yeah. And the time horizon's so long, right? Like, nobody tells you that. You're like, if you're going to see anything from this, it's going to be 10 years down the road. And oh, by the way, you're going to get diluted, which when I started, I was like, what do you mean 10 years? And someone can, explain to me dilution. Like, I don't understand. You're like, I was getting all these shares or 0.25% equity, which still is really good as an advisor, but, still to be determined what I will see from that. And I would say the first time I got equity was probably like 5 years ago. So nothing yet.
And then, but I will say, like, all the work that I did in an advisory capacity, it helped me build relationships those relationships have paid 100x dividends.
And I think in addition to the relationships, which I totally agree with you, the language, right? Speaking the language.
Yeah.
There's a startup language, for sure there's a business language. And, I think this may come up later in our conversation, but one of the things I sort of wish I knew in medicine when I first started out was that business is really important and nobody really cared to teach us anything about it. And I just wish that I went into medicine a little bit more knowledgeable about business, or at least be able to understand enough to speak the language. Because no matter what you do in medicine, you need to understand that it's a business. You might be a department chair, you're going to run your department, you're going to have a budget. That's business. You may be a researcher in a lab. Similarly, grants, money, indirects. That's the business side, right? So I really, truly knew nothing about business. And that's what prompted me to go to business school, just a few years ago. It wasn't because I needed another degree. And people ask me all the time, well, do doctors need MBAs? Like, no, you totally don't need another degree. But depending on what you want to do, you have to speak the language. And to me, it was a way that it made sense. So the relationships and the language and understanding the culture, which is a little bit different than the culture in the hospital. I think all of those things are really important.
I mean, that's our fundamental thesis at ClinX, which is if you want to have impact at scale, you have to understand the business model. You have to understand the incentives, the regulatory framework, right? You have to understand these things. Otherwise, you can't actually succeed.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting, and again, you and I have talked about this a little bit, is that the clinical piece matters across all of those things, right? So when we talk about advisors and you're translating the clinical piece, like, yes, that's for sure happening, but it doesn't just happen in one of those areas. It happens across the board. And that, I think, was a huge lesson learned for me working in-house for my first startup. I was like, okay, well, you're a physician, but turns out you can bring a lot of value to sales and marketing. You're like, what? Like how?
Yes.
Oh, because there's a message there that we need to talk to the clinicians about the technology, help us understand what resonates with them. Okay, makes sense now. Regulatory, we're going to the FDA, similar sort of concept. And so I don't think I appreciated early on that there was clinical value across all these verticals of startups, but for sure that's the case. And so, and for me, I love the tech, right? I love the engineering, and I'm not practicing engineering.
Yeah.
So, you know, some of those folks are really the smartest people on the planet, but being able to understand like what they're building and why it matters and help them understand that early on, making sure we're building solutions to problems we actually have is really important.
I really want to emphasize one of the points that you made, which is the role of the physician in sales and business development. When I was at SiriusMD, which was a national scale telehealth company, and we were selling telehealth services to payers, it was an absolute must that one of us physician leaders was on the sales team when we were pitching the health plan, because the health plan oftentimes had a CMO on their side.
Yeah.
If the buyer has a CMO on their side and you don't have a physician on your side, like that sale isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
I can almost promise you that.
I totally agree.
And I have seen physicians on sales teams absolutely destroy the deal because they don't understand business etiquette. They don't understand the business model. They don't understand the finances. So if you want to play that role, which is a fun role to play, you really have to understand this stuff. What have you seen in that?
Oh my gosh, so many stories. And I totally agree with you. You know, when I first started working for startups, it's like, you know, we'll have you help us with sales. And you're like, wait, what? You know, me? Sales? Like, no, I don't think I'd be very good at that. And I will say, having worked very closely with the sales team, people who are in sales as their career, they are good. And it is not only just a skill, it's an art, and they're incredibly talented. You know, I think sales gets a bad rap because, you know, people say, oh, you're like a used car salesman. Like maybe used car salesmen or women are like quite lovely people too. I don't know. But, you know, I feel like they get a bad rap around sales. But again, technology doesn't get into the hospital if you can't sell it. So they're an important part of the equation. I will say I have found it for me that it's better if I work closely with the sales team who takes the lead. And then to your point, when you're on those calls, being the voice of the clinician and then speaking to the clinician on the other side of the table has really helped with closing deals, right? Clinicians understand clinicians. And I think that relationship cannot be underestimated. Yeah. I do think that if physicians are taking the lead on sales and maybe making some of those cold emails, cold calls, physicians on the other end of that are like, what? Like, why are you doing that? You know, so I think it kind of comes with a little bit of the head tilt. So just, you know, caution folks there. But, you know, oftentimes I'm like, oh, I'm terrible in sales. And then people in industry are actually like, you're actually not. And I think it's just because if we believe in something and we talk about it, it turns out that like that sells. And so it's a little bit reframing what does sales actually look like and why different people can be good at sales. Yeah. But the last piece I will say is that people in general, including physicians, you need to maintain your integrity in that process. Yeah. So because when it comes to networking, I do think physicians are more open to networking with other physicians. You know, I remember once someone said like, well, can you just set up some sales calls for us and then send the sales team? You don't even have to go. And I was like, no, like you don't understand. Like doctors don't do that to doctors. Like I can't do that. Like that's a bait and switch and I won't. So just know, you know, like you said, business etiquette or some of the practices, it may all be well and good. It may all be ethical. It may all be the way things happen. But I do think people need to be true to themselves. And you have to step out of your comfort zone to a point, but don't start to, you know, don't start to question your own integrity values. Yeah. Like stay true to yourself.
I totally agree. The kind of model that worked best for me was before we would have like an introductory sales call, we would, you know, research the buyer as much as we could. And then I would actually sit down with the sales team and we would strategize exactly like how to frame it and who was going to say what. And having like me or another physician in that strategy session was always so helpful. So you can play a leading role in the prep, and then, as you said, in the actual like live pitch, it's more like a support or an adjunct, right? And chiming in at just the right time and framing things.
Yeah.
So tell me, when there's a new opportunity for you in terms of an advisory role, or let's say fractional CMO type role, how do you assess whether this is going to be worth your time?
Oh, so it's a great question. So first, it has to be good people, good tech. Like if you're not a good team or people that I like and I want to grab a drink with or coffee with, and you don't have a technology that I think actually can help, then those are my two to actually get into the conversation. Yeah. And then I would say I've been very fortunate that many of my roles actually evolve from starting off as an advisor or a partner, within academics leading a project, and then the project ended, and the startup would say, okay, well, the project ended, but we would still love, some of your time. So if that presents itself as an opportunity, I say go for it for a few reasons. One, it gives you a better sense of the people that you're working with and the technology itself. And it's a nice way to sort of ease on into it as opposed to jumping all in. I think the other piece of advice I would give to that is, plus minus on equity early on. Some companies are so early that they don't have a lot of cash and they're going to offer equity out the gate. Yeah. That's fine. But some are going to offer cash a little and then sort of have a vetting process, and then they hold on to their equity a little bit more. And so then getting equity comes later. And I would say people should think about that too. Once you get equity, it sounds great, but then you're a bit tied to them. And, some of my colleagues will say getting married is easy, getting divorced is hard. And, in a way, these relationships are, again, we've talked about the time horizon. If you're getting involved in an early stage company, if you want to stay involved, it's 5-10 years, and you want to make sure that you like the people. So for me, that's really how I think about it. What is the technology? Who are the people? Do I believe in this? Do I think this would be fun to be a part of that team? The compensation piece, I'm usually really flexible. So I haven't turned down opportunities because that we couldn't meet somewhere that made sense for both sides.
I agree with all that. And I would add, what's the business model? Like the people and product, absolutely like priority. But if the business model doesn't make sense, then this thing's not going to work, right? And part of that business model is like, who's the buyer? How are you going to get to the buyer, right? And even if you get to the buyer, are they going to be able to do the change management to deploy the solution, right? Which is a huge challenge in healthcare, right? You have the best new gadget, but like deploying it and getting people to use it is like an absolute nightmare. And then do the unit economics work? Like, can you actually turn this into a business that makes money? And if you can't solve all of those elements, you don't have a business.
Right. It's so true. And I think I could imagine physicians listening to this, what do I know about business models, and maybe they don't have a lot of experience with that, but asking those questions to hear the answer will also be very insightful if there's a plan. And to your point, I think a lot of people talk about a business plan, but you also need a regulatory plan and a reimbursement plan. And not all devices will, again, speaking about devices, which I feel closest to, will be successful just on being reimbursed, right? Like maybe different models, maybe the hospital pays for them outright. Maybe the patient absorbs some of that cost. I don't know all the answers. It really depends on the situation. But again, it has to be thought out. Okay, if there's a CPT code for this, great. If there isn't, what does it take to get one? And will that be sufficient? And if the reimbursement model also doesn't work, then the business model needs to be really strong without it, right? So kind of just understanding the nuances there is important. And the reality, the other piece, that I think about, having been in it a long time, I feel more well-versed in some of these different areas that we're talking about. But by no means am I a regulatory expert. And so I think at some point you also get really comfortable with like, okay, here's what I know. I know if you don't have a plan, that's not great. So you should have a plan. And then you start to hear and you're like, oh, this actually sounds like a solid plan. So you may not be the one developing that plan, but over time, you go through this enough times, you start to pick up on little things, or you see how another company did it well. And can you bring that knowledge with you to a different company? You know, again, obviously you're not going to violate any NDAs, conflicts of interest, anything like that. But the knowledge, you know, that piece can also be important when you're working with multiple companies.
Amazing. Alyssa, this has been such a great chat, and really appreciate you taking the time. Any kind of final comments? Where can people find you?
People can find me on LinkedIn. That's my my main gig when it comes to social media. So definitely feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help folks if I can. And then I think my last words of advice would be just to be curious. You know, if you're using a technology in the hospital, you think it could be better, or you wonder how your hospital even buys that, like ask, you know, figure out if there's a vendor, talk to them, see if they need some advisors. If you meet startups and you're not sure if, you know, they're looking for folks, just ask. You know, I think people talk about finding your passion, but I think sometimes it's hard to find your passion if you're not sure what that looks like beyond your clinical specialty. So I would just encourage people to be curious, ask a lot of questions, and challenge them to get outside of their comfort zone a little.
Awesome. Fantastic. Dr. Alyssa Abo, thank you so much.
My pleasure.